Hey guys, welcome to this second installment of All Around Sound Theory. My name is Troy, and welcome back. If this is your first time joining us, you probably want to check out my first episode where I'm talking about what music is. If you have no idea, um, even if you do, you might want to just check it out just to see where I'm coming from. But if you have checked out the first program, welcome, and welcome to the second. Welcome back. So, in this one, what we're going to talk about is notation, music notation. It's going to be my introduction into how you would be able to recognize and maybe even create your own sheet music and notate the sounds that we talked about in the first episode. Okay, and this one is going to go a little bit more in depth. I mean, maybe a lot more in depth. So, if you have questions, please let me know. Please let me know. Um, I'm always about a conversation, so please let me know and we can talk. So, in this episode, as I always say, we always have vocabulary. So, in this one, we have a little bit more than we did last time. So, in this one, we're going to talk about staff and staves. You'll be able to identify clefs. We will talk about notes, the different types of notes, and talk about rests as well. Now, this is the one where we're going to get really deep into intervals, and I had mentioned that in the previous episode where we're going to talk about intervals. So we're going to get really deep into this. Now, we have a lot more vocabulary. There is some additional vocabulary. So when we talk about notes, we're talking about stems. These are the parts of the note: the flag, beams, and the note head. All right, let's get to it. So, how do we notate pitch? We notate pitch on something that is called a staff. Now, notice in this image there are 5 lines and 4 spaces. Okay? When we run out of those lines and spaces, we go above or below with what are called ledger lines, as you can see in this image. So, the staff consists of 5 lines and 4 spaces. Again, that's 5 lines and 4 spaces. And we count from bottom to top. We count from the bottom up. And in music, the staff is used to indicate a precise desired pitch. Remember in the previous episode, we differentiated tones from pitches. And we said there are 7 tone names in the musical alphabet, A through G. But we have to differentiate the different pitches in octaves. So that is the purpose of the staff and the clefs. So take a look at this image. This is what we call a grand staff. Now, the grand staff is a combination of the treble and bass staff from top to bottom, respectively, which are joined together by a brace. Now, I want you to take a look at this image. I'm going to go a little further in depth with it. Okay? So you'll notice my notations here, my notes here. This top staff is called a treble staff. The one below it is called a bass staff. You'll notice the orange lettering, the orange names on the right of the screen. And the thing towards the left, that looks like a big curvy thing, is a brace. So that brace connects the treble and the bass staff together. Now, notice the notation of what we call the clefs. There are 3 different clefs on this in this grand staff. The treble consists of what we call a G or a treble clef. The bass has what's called an F or a bass clef. And you'll notice that this thing in the middle is what we call a C clef. We're going to differentiate all 3 types of clefs. When I say 3 types, I mean the difference between the G, C, and F. But just because they're G, C, and F clefs, they each have unique positioning. There's not one position that they can be in. So let's get to it. Now, I just want to show you this image. The grand staff, as we said, a staff has 5 lines, 4 spaces. Once upon a time, the grand staff was 11 lines. And the middle C, see that C on the right side? That is how we notate middle C, C4 in the piano. If you notice on the left side how that line is gone, with the grand staff and the brace that connects it towards the left side of the grand staff, you can kind of think of the brace. Let me go back. See how this brace here lines up with the C, with that middle C, and how it also lines up with this C clef here? So you can also always think that that middle line should be right there, even though it's not there anymore, because it definitely helps to see a little less. That middle line, that sixth line, that is not there, is what we call middle C today. So let's get into the clefs and how we differentiate. This is a very important quote, and once again, there's that image. We cannot read notes on the staff's lines and spaces without a clef, the symbol that appears to the far left of every staff. The clef tells which line or space represents which pitch in which octave, and that's from Jane Clendening, Miss Jane Clendening. Love that book. And so, again, here's that image. Look at the clefs in relation to the grand staff. You have that G clef on the top, that treble clef. You have that C clef in the middle. That we don't know which C clef that is. And then you have that F clef below, which is a bass clef. Now there are different types of G, C, and F clefs. And I wanted to show you this. I love this image. This is the relationship of the G, the treble clef, the bass clef, and the alto and tenor clefs in relation to middle C. Notice there are two different two different C clefs. One is the alto, one is the tenor clef. We're going to get into the specifics of the differences of G, C, and F clefs in just a little bit. But I want you to see how these clefs lie in relation to middle C. Clefs don't lie. Clefs are always going to be your best mile marker when it comes to pitch notation. I'm going to show you why in just a second. What are the clefs? So now here are some of the different G clefs. Why we call this a G clef? The first reason, let me just say this. First of all, this kind of looks like a stylized G, as we say. It looks like a cursive G or something like that. But if you notice where that line curls, notice how it curls on that second line. That line, whichever line it curls on, is going to be G4. That line is going to denote the fourth G on the piano. And I'm going to show you in relation to the piano. So that G on the G clef, that fourth G is G4. Remember when we talked about octaves in the first episode, we said the first C on the piano is C4, right? Okay? So the C above that, or excuse me, let's say the first C on the piano is C1. Did I say C4? No, C4 is middle C. Kind of got a little confused there. Let's start over. So the first C on the piano is C1. So the G directly above that would be G1, right? So if that's G1, the G above that is going to be G2, G3, G4. G4 is the G directly above middle C. Let us transition back for a second. So actually, we don't want to transition there just yet. So actually, we may want to transition there. We'll come back to that in a minute. So wherever that line curls, whatever line that hook curls on is G4. So look at the French violin clef next to it. See how it curls on the first line? Even though it's curving on the first line now instead of the second, that is still G4. The clef has just been repositioned to acclimate to the range of the instrument. What does that mean? Let me say that again. The clef has been repositioned to acclimate for the range of the instrument. So therefore, we don't have to have an excess of ledger lines either way, above or below the staff. Yes, you probably will have some ledger lines. But if you adjust to acclimate to the instrument, depending on its range, you can minimize the amount of ledger lines. Okay, so now let's go on to the third one here. You'll notice that there's an 8 on the top of this G clef, third from the left. And you'll notice that there's an 8 on the bottom, the one furthest most right. What those mean, the one with the 8 on the top means whatever is written is going to be played an octave lower than written. So if let's say there was a G4 written on that, or let's just say that there was a note written on the G line below, that would mean instead of the G4, I would be playing an octave below that, which would be G3. Okay? All right. So let me just go over here for a second, and I'm going to try to show you what I'm talking about. Let's try to bring it all together. So, hang on a second. Let's transition over here. All right, my friends. So bear with me on this. So we said that that G that curls around the G4, that the G that the G clef clefs curls around is the fourth G, the G above middle C. So let me just write. I'm just going to show you. That is how we notate middle C. You see what I've done with the right hand? That's what middle C looks like on the right with the right hand. The G above that is that. Notice how that note is on the line that that G clef curls on. Okay? So no matter where that clef curls, it's always going to be the same frequency. It is always going to be the same pitch. And if you know what I'm talking about, if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back to the first episode. The clef is going to be your best mile marking indication when it comes to notation, because the clefs don't lie. It is always going to be the same frequency, no matter if it's a G, a C, or an F clef. So let's get back to the clefs, and we're going to transition. All right. So now let's talk about the F clefs. So the one furthest most to the left is probably the most common, arguably the most common. I would venture to say it's the most common of the F clefs, and it's the bass clef. Now notice we call this an F clef for two reasons. First being it looks like a stylized F to some, but also, as I said, notice these two dots here. The line they sandwich is always going to be F3, the third F on the piano. Okay? So what does that mean? Let's switch for just a second. I'm going to transition over here. Let me situate my mic so I have some free hands. Give me a second. All right, guys, hang on. So now, we're going to bring this stand over here just a second. Okay, so let's switch down to the bass staff. Notice here on this bass staff, I'm going to play the C below middle C, so you see where we write that. C, pun, sorry. Now, as I said, those two dots in the F clef sandwich the F directly below middle C, okay? Notice those two dots, notice the line they're sandwiching. Notice where that note just went. Wherever those two dots sandwich is always going to be F3, the third F on the piano. I'm going to say that again. Wherever those two dots sandwich, whichever line, it would always be F3, the third F on the piano, which is always going to be the same frequency. Okay? Ooh, I wish I had my frequencies handy. I'd tell you the specific number. Maybe I'll do that. Maybe I'll do an addendum or something like that. But always keep that in mind. So we said the G clef curls around the fourth G4, and then those two dots are sandwiched. Or excuse me, those two dots sandwich the F3, the third F on the piano. All right? Let's transition back. All right. So now let's take a look at these other F clefs. So now you notice the one in the middle is called a baritone clef. Notice how the line sandwich is the third line and not the fourth compared to the bass clef. This goes back to what I said before. The clef has changed to acclimate to the instrument, so not as many ledger lines are required. Okay, you may not see that very often. You may not see that clef very often, but you may. You never know. Especially if you're a researcher or in music history, ethnomusicology, musicology, things like that. And then lastly, you'll notice the F clef with the 8 below it. It just means you're going to play an octave lower than written. So now let's get to the C clefs. Now these two are the most common of the C clefs. Now remember how I said before how the C clef looked like the brace that hooked the grand staff together, that hooked the treble and the bass staves together. Notice this little hook in the middle. Wherever the line falls in that hook, that is always going to be middle C. So, matter of fact, let's just go back a little bit. So, remember this little image. So you see how that little hook in the middle of it is there? That is middle C. So now you have your G, your C, and your F clef. The G clef will always denote G4. The F clef will always denote F3. And the C clef will always denote middle C. So now when you see the C clef on the third line, that is the alto clef. C clefs you will see sometimes in older vocal scores, especially older opera scores, because these were used for vocalists and are still used for some vocalists. You'll see in certain scores. The tenor clef. Alto clef is used for also instruments like the viola. I can't think of anything else. Trombone, maybe? I'm really bad when it comes to... I won't throw myself under the bus like that. But I do know tenor clef is also another common one. You will see that for trombone, definitely, and several other instruments as well. But those are probably the common C clefs, okay? Now, here are some other antiquated C clefs, which I have in some of my opera scores, including that soprano clef, and the mezzo-soprano clef. But they're very rarely used. You don't see them very often. Now, notice there's another baritone clef there as well. Okay, so now, if you compare all the C clefs, notice that the soprano clef starts on line 1, the mezzo is on line 2, the alto is line 3, the tenor is line 4, and the baritone is line 5. Again, these are all to acclimate to the particular instruments. You don't want to have too many ledger lines for a voice part or any instrument that is going to read these clefs. So you acclimate, you adjust the clef to acclimate to the instrument. But no matter where this hook lies, it's always going to be C4. It's always going to be middle C. So even that soprano clef on line 1 is middle C. On the mezzo-soprano clef where line 2 is middle C. In the baritone clef, line 5 is written as middle C. And that is how it all relates, okay? So let's just go through the notes on the G clef. And from the line, the 5 lines going up, the letters are E, G, B, D, F. And you'll hear some people say, every good boy does fine, every good boy deserves fudge, and the old mnemonics or whatever you call them, The spaces, the 4 spaces going up, are F-A-C-E, face. Oh my God. Yeah. So that's how we identify the treble. And then the bass staff, I'm actually thinking I'm probably going to, I didn't do the, the alto, guys. Sorry about that. So the lines from the bottom up are G, B, D, F, A. Good boys do fine always, or good boys deserve fudge always. I don't know. I just pulled that out of somewhere. And you'll notice that the spaces from 1 to 4 are A, C, E, G, A, C, G, all cows eat grass, all cars eat gas, blah, 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 these mnemonics. So again, the grand staff, you'll see the grand staff in relation, or the clefs in relation to the grand staff. The clefs are going to be your mile markers, man. Just know that. Wherever the line curls on G, it's going to be G4. Wherever that hook is on the C clef, it's C4. Wherever the 2 dot sandwich on F, it's F3. That's never going to change. It's never going to change. Again, to Clendening's definition, we cannot read notes on the staff's lines and spaces without a clef. The symbol that appears to the far left of every staff. The clef tells which line or space represents which pitch in which octave. So now moving on, we're talking about notes. All right. Now look at this diagram here. You'll notice the staff and the G clef. You'll also notice the 4/4 number that's right there. That's what we call a time signature. We will get to that in our next lesson when we talk about rhythm. and go into a little bit more of the layout. So now, as was said earlier, the parts of a note are the head, the stem, the flag, and beams. Now, not all notes are beamed. We'll get to that in just a second. So, looking at this image, you'll see the difference in the note head if you look to the left. And you'll notice that the long stick is a stem. And notice that some of the notes have flags, but some of them don't. You'll notice that as we go on a little bit further, that some notes have one flag, some have two, up to four flags. So here is a little bit of notation to show some of the flagged and beamed notes. Now, a beam eliminates the need for multiple flags. However, it is not uncommon for monosyllabic classical vocal music to refrain from using beams. Beams, yeah. So notice in the first, what we call measure over here, notice where the first beam arrow is to the left. You'll notice that there are some notes with flags going down that aren't connected, but you'll notice that there are four which are. You can use beams to connect them so it's a little bit easier to read, but sometimes they won't be connected if it's a vocal line and it's one word per note or something like that, which is what the monosyllabic classical vocal music comment refers to. So now here are different types of notes. This one is kind of a, I say air quote, rare note because you don't see it very often, but you never know. You may see it sometime. This is what we call a whole note, or outside of the U.S., it may be called a semibrev. Actually, this is a brev. That is not a semibrev. Excuse me. This is actually not a whole note or a semibrev. This is what we refer to as a double whole note. This is a double whole note, or a brev. This is not a whole note semibrev. This is a double whole note brev. So this is what a whole note looks like to the left. That's what an actual whole note semibrev looks like. Okay, you'll see that more than you will the brev. You will definitely see that more than you will the brev. I guess I should be specific. The whole note is what we typically call it in the States, and outside it may be referred to as a brev or a semibrev. So basically, if it's on the right side of the slash, it's going to be an international term. Notice that you also have half notes. Notice the whole note is just a head. There's no stem or anything like that. And then the half note is a head with a stem. The quarter note, or the crochet, is a head, a stem, but the head has been filled in. And then notice in the next image to the right that you have a mixture of quarter notes and eighth notes, what we call eighth notes. They're all outside of the U.S., they can be referred to as crochets and quavers. So what we call an eighth note is referred to as a quaver. Notice that the quaver, the eighth note, has one flag. It has a flag, a single flag, okay? There are others with flags, plenty of flags, 16ths and 32nds we'll get into. These things here are called accidentals. And what you see from left to right is a sharp, a flat, and a natural. A number sign, a B, and a natural, or a hashtag, a B, and blah, blah, blah. There are actually two more accidentals, a double sharp and a double flat. We'll talk about accidentals in another video, or you can click right here and check it out. So now, in reference to notes, we also have to talk about rests. So rests denote the duration of silence. Okay, so now, as we differentiated the notes, we have to differentiate the rests. So this is a whole rest. Notice it hangs down from line 4. It looks like an upside down hat. It looks like one of those upside down, I don't know what you call those, bowling hats maybe? And I used to tell my students a joke. To differentiate the half rests, as you see here, how it sits on line 3 compared to the whole rest, which hangs down from line 4. And I'm just going to transition just for a quick second and say the way I used to differentiate the whole rest from a half rest to my students is, think of it like a bowling hat. The half rest is like a hat that's resting, okay? So half hat. But, when you drink your whole thing or you eat your whole thing of too much, you might throw up your whole guts and take that hat off whole. Yeah, I mean, some students thought, ew, gross. But I mean, that's the way I thought of it. It's like it's a hat. When it's on your head, it's hat half. When you have too much, whole, you're throwing it out. I know, it's crazy, right? But anyway, so we're transitioning back. That's how I differentiate the half and the whole rests, okay? So now these are the quarter rests. They kind of like lightning bolts with a little hook on them, the crochet rest. So each of these is a quarter rest of silence, depending on what the time signature is, which we'll get into. Then you have eighth rests, 16th rests, 32nd rest. Notice the names. 64th rest, the hemi, demi, semiquaver. Okay? And then there's a 128th. That looks a little cleaner. Okay? Now we're going to start talking about intervals. Dun, dun, dun. This is one of my favorite topics here. So the basic definition of an interval is the distance between two notes or pitches. Intervals have two components, a quantitative and a qualitative interval. So there is a quality and a numeric component to it. Intervals can be harmonic when they're played simultaneously or melodic, one after another like a melody. And I'm just going to transition just for a second, if I may, because I want to show you the difference between the melodic and the harmonic intervals. Let's do this transition real quick. Okay, so I'm going to rest my mic. All right, friends. So, as you can see, you have in the harmonic interval, you have a C and a G, which are being played at the same time. So you have C and G. Okay? But the melodic interval, like a melody, is one note after the other. So you have harmonic, harmony, melodic, melody. Okay? That is the difference between a harmonic interval and a melodic interval. Okay. Gotta watch those chords. All right. Moving on, moving forward. Let's transition again. Or let's keep it moving here. So now, intervals. The smallest and arguably most important interval is the half step, or the semitone. 2 half steps equal 1 whole tone. So what do I mean by half steps or semitones? All right, let's use C once again. Okay, so if I start on C, all right, starting on C, a half step above it would be the next key directly to the right. So not the white key, but the black key. So a half step above C would be C sharp or D flat. Now this gets into the accidentals and harmonic spellings that we were talking about before. Okay, so a quick definition on the accidentals. Whenever you make something whenever you sharpen something, when you raise it a half step, you make it sharp. If you lower it a half step, you make it flat. If you lower it a whole step, it's a double flat. If you raise it a whole step, it's a double sharp. That's just the touch base on the accidentals. We'll get further in depth with that. Although, I mean, that's pretty much it. But anyway. So it depends on how things are being written. So you have that C to C sharp would be considered one thing. D to D flat would be considered something else. But anyway, so the half step is arguably the most important interval because a half step makes the difference between a major chord and a minor chord. What am I talking about? We'll talk about the qualities in just a little bit. We'll talk about chords in the 4th lesson. But a half step can change the entire quality of what you're playing. So it is definitely, I would say, the most important. Okay? So let's just look at the layout of the piano. We said C to C sharp or D flat is a half step. C natural to D natural will be a whole step, right? So you have a half step, whole step. D to E would be a whole step. Okay? But now check this out. E to F, there's nothing in between, so that's a half step. E to F is a half step, just as B to C is. Anywhere on the piano. So notice your half steps and your whole steps. Okay? Moving on. So, there is a quantitative and a qualitative there are components, excuse me, quantitative and qualitative components to intervals, all right? So what that means is intervals are measured in seconds, thirds, fourths, as I said before. So what do I mean by that? C to D is a second because D comes right after C. C to E is a third. C to F is a fourth. C to G is a fifth. C to A is a sixth. C to B is a seventh. C to C above, apart an octave, is an octave, an eighth. Now, in terms of intervals, you can go higher, ninths, tenths. Those usually happen in jazz music. God bless the jazz musician. God bless y'all. My ear. It's beautiful. I should also say that I have perfect pitch. So sometimes you hear something, you're like, ooh. But yeah, so in terms of classical and most other non-jazz music, popular music and things like that, we usually don't include 13ths or 11ths, but you can. There's no rule that says you cannot, except for maybe the most hardcore jazz musician. But anyway, we're not going to do that right now. So anyway, when we talk about the quantitative, we're usually talking about unisons, ones to octaves, unless you're talking about jazz. Now, when we're talking about qualitative, when we're talking about qualities, intervals are measured with the following qualities, okay? You have a major quality, minor, perfect, augmented, and diminished. Now, it's important to notice, or to note, the interval of the augmented fourth, diminished fifth, is also referred to as a tritone. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So, this goes back to a little bit what I was saying before. So, we're starting on C natural. Look at the image on the left. So C to C, let's say it was a melodic interval. This is a melodic interval because we're not playing at the same time. So that melodic interval, because it's the same pitch, it's the same, the same pitch, and the same note in this instance because they're both written the same. It is what we call a perfect prime because they're both C's. You don't see it written as a perfect prime too often, but it might be called perfect unison as well. I usually refer to it as unison, but C to C would be a perfect prime. So now, this is where it gets a little interesting. As I said before, now, you can call that C to D flat, and it would be a type of second. But if you refer to this as C to C sharp, it's actually called an augmented prime and not a second because they're both C's. That is the difference. That is what we call diatonicism, if that's the word. That's what it means to be diatonic compared to chromatic. And we will get into the definition of what it is to be diatonic as opposed to chromatic in episode 4. Okay, join us for that one. All right, so if I write that as a C to C sharp, it's actually called an augmented prime. But interestingly, if I write that as a C to D flat, it's a minor second because C to D is a second. But the quality of that is minor as opposed to C to D natural as on the right, which would be a major second. Okay, let's do that again. C to C sharp is an augmented prime. But if I turn that C sharp into an enharmonic spelling of D flat, it becomes C to D flat, as denoted on the left side of the screen, and it becomes a minor second. Minor second, major second, minor second, major second. Notice that minor second could also be written as an augmented prime if notated as such in a score. I may be going too deep. Let's keep it moving. All right. So now that we've said that that can be a minor second, major second, now C to D sharp or E flat, depending on how you spell it, as you can see here, can either be an augmented second or a minor third. Personally, I don't see it written as an augmented second too often. That does not mean it cannot happen. There are very few absolutes in music. I'm going to say that again. There are very few absolutes in music. I am not the type of person who likes to use the word never, and it's a very rare thing for me to say never. I don't know if I've ever said never in music, but yeah, there are not a lot of absolutes. Anyway, back on track. So that can be written as an augmented second if you consider this a D sharp, or it can be a minor third if you consider it an E flat. Okay? Moving on. C to E natural. C natural to E natural is a major third. All right? So you have minor second, major second, minor third, major third. Now, there's no half step here. C to F is what we call a perfect fourth. So there are perfect, majors, minors, augmented, and diminished. As we said, we're going to get into those in just a little bit. So C to F is a perfect fourth. Okay? Now, C to F sharp or G flat is what we refer to as that tritone. The tritone is an interesting quality in sound. The tritone can either be written as an augmented fourth, if you write this as a C natural to an F sharp, or it can be considered a diminished fifth if you write it as a C to a G flat. It all depends on how it's spelled. Now, from C to G natural is what we call a perfect fifth. That's another perfect interval. The perfect intervals are the unison, the fourth, the fifth, and the octave, because those are the purest of sounds, arguably the purest of sounds. So your fifths are perfect, your fourths are perfect, unless they're augmented or diminished, and your unisons and your octaves are also perfect. So there's your C to G. Now, this is a C to A flat. If you write that as an A flat, that is a minor sixth, okay? C to A natural is a major sixth. If we write this as a C to A sharp, it is considered an augmented sixth. But if we make that A sharp a B flat, which we don't see here, it's a minor seventh. But if we raise that minor seventh to a major seventh, that B natural, which you see on the left, that's what you get, a major seventh. There's your major seventh. And then your perfect octave, C to C. There's your major, okay? Your melodic. Okay? So those are the basics when it comes to intervals, right? And here is my bibliography that I've used. I think there may be one or two other things. But if you have questions, just let me know. And I appreciate y'all coming to join me on this musical journey. This has been in the works for a long time, so I'm very, very, very happy and feeling very blessed to bring this to you. I'm very, very fortunate. So thank you guys. Join me for the third installment, because guess what? We're going to talk about rhythm. We need to talk about rhythm. It ain't just sound, people. You got to get your beats together. Anyway, thanks for joining. I'll see you soon.